Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. It's about opportunities for women in international trade, the Asia Pacific and Latin America experience. Before we get started, I want to let you know that we have simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish because our speakers are going to be talking in both languages. To choose the language that you want to listen to this webinar in, please go to the globe icon that you have at the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language. I am Florencia Merino. I am an economist and I work with IDB INTAL, and I'm going to be one of the moderators at today's webinar. Integrados Network at IDB INTAL is turning 2, and it's a network that gathers academics, students, and professors that work with the development of the region connected with trade and integration. And we work with different topics like the digital, the gender, and the green agendas. Our network targets people younger than 35 so that they can learn more about all of these processes in order to become drivers of change in a region that is growing more sustainable, inclusive, and developed. If you're not members of our networks already, please join us so that you can find out about all the other activities that we are planning for the rest of the year, and you have the link for that in the chat. In today's webinar, we are going to hear from experts from different topics, in particular gender and integration, and they're going to share their view about what's going on in Asia Pacific and Latin America. But we do not just have experts with us. We have young people as well. These experts are young people, so they're going to share their view about incorporating the trade agenda and the gender agenda together. At the end of the session, we are going to have a Q&A, so please leave your questions in the chat. We think that this is a very important space for us to gather because we have been working with these topics for a couple of years now. We do research, we do workshops and training sessions in order to study and understand the links between gender and trade because we want to see how women participate in different capacities. And that's how we develop and we reflect about the different practices that we can incorporate into our policies. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Ana Vasco, the director of Intel, who's going to pick the ball by sharing some words about trade and gender and give us some tools that we have in order to tackle the gap that women face in this arena. Anna, you have the floor. Hi, hello. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. In particular, thank you to our four speakers that we have today. As Florencia said, trade and gender is key for us. It's one of our 5 axis of work. And what we want is to promote integration of women in international trade, not only as a worker, but also as a business person. And why? Because we believe that women have the right to profit from all that trade has to offer. We know that there are a lot of positive aspects to trade, and also because there's clear evidence that if women participate in the economy, in particular in the export sector, that can contribute to economic development in general. On top of that, we understand that there is a clear participation gap when it comes to women participating in exports, both as workers and as business people. We have carried out different research from IDB Intel, and we see that only 1 in 3 people working in exporting companies are women, and only 20% of companies that do exporting are women-led. And this shows that there's a clear gender gap. And this gap is even wider than the one that we see in general in the economy, both as workers and as business people. And what are the explanations for this gap? Well, there are several factors contributing to it, but one of this is the poor distribution of chores within households. And that means that women do not have as much time to learn to become entrepreneurs or to work in an exporting country company because the challenges that these companies face are bigger than the ones that work in the domestic market. On top of that, we have more difficulty accessing funding, networks, and all of this is connected to the cultural barriers that exist in Latin America even today. We can talk about different micro inequalities that make us think that we are not fit for different tasks, for example, to become entrepreneurs. So, what do we need and where we are going? Well, we need to find a way to be more inclusive when it comes to drafting trade agreements. And we're going to see that Latin America has been a pioneer when it comes to including chapters dedicated to gender in trade agreements. We think that we need to have a gender perspective when it comes to trade negotiations, and we also need to try to have greater inclusion um, when it comes to trade, in particular, for example, in technology, because we see that the gap there is wider than in other sectors. For this, we need the private sector to commit to include women and to generate incentives for that inclusion. Some tools that could be used are transparency, greater transparency when it comes to salaries, greater maternity leave, and even quota when it comes to women in leadership positions. We can also think about building international networks for sectors where women are predominant. For example, in education, we think that if we build these networks, there's a lot to gain. Actually, we have a research that we did a couple of years ago that shows that these type of networks, for example, in the 5G sector, can promote greater inclusion. These are some measures and ideas that could be promoted, and for this we need a public-private partnership. And of course, we would also be accepting of any policy that contributes to this end goal. With this being said, thank you again for joining us today. I am sure that we are going to find new ideas and new inspiration today so that we can keep building a more equitable and inclusive society in Latin America. Thank you, Anna, for your work. Now I'm going to introduce Amrita Bahri, who is a professor at law at the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico. And together with Dorotea López Giral and Shan Reni, she has co-authored a book, Trade Policy and Gender Equality. So, Amrita, welcome.
Right. So, thank you for this opportunity to the organizers and to the fellow panelists for having the platform to talk to you about the topic of gender equality and trade agreements in Asia Pacific. Um, this is a topic that has been in the literature, in the news, in the policy dialogues, in the corridors quite a lot recently, to the extent that we have heard expressions like gender mainstreaming and gender equality in trade agreements. Gender mainstreaming has become a buzzword. But I think it is important for us to take a step back and 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 answer some very basic questions. Because if we don't answer them, they lead to resistance. When we talk about Asia Pacific, we are talking about a big group of countries. We are talking about developing countries, but we are also talking about developed countries. We are talking about developed countries that have led the inclusion of gender equality based commitments and trade agreements. But we are also talking about developing countries that have stayed far away from even talking about gender and trade in the same sentence, let alone them including a whole provision or a chapter on gender equality in trade agreements. So we will talk about four questions in this chat today. One, why use trade agreements to empower women? Why trade agreements? Second, can they help? Third, what's happening in Asia Pacific? What kind of provisions do we have? How women or gender equality has been talked about in trade agreements signed by Asia Pacific countries. And finally, the problems and hesitations that have led to a lot of resistance in the area of Asia Pacific in these countries against the inclusion of women related commitments in trade agreements. So, why use trade agreements? To answer the first question, well, the answer is simple. Trade agreements are market access instruments. And now we know for sure that their impact is not gender neutral. Trade agreements have had different distributive impact on different vulnerable groups. And it has had different outcomes for women and men, simply because of the resource endowments and the different roles that women and men play in respective economies. On one hand, we have a large wealth of scholarship that has shown to us that trade agreements have contributed in many positive ways for the empowerment and protection of vulnerable groups such as women. They have lowered the barriers to trade, including tariff and non-tariff barriers, that ultimately benefits all the consumers, including women. It has increased employment and business opportunities for all, including women. It has decreased the prices of goods and services, and increased the quality of goods and services for the consumers, including women. And it has led women to save time on multiple power time saving devices, such as simple devices such as a liquador, a dishwasher at home, that could allow us to have more time at hand and invest that time in educational and professional opportunities. And it has helped women break barriers at the borders and within the borders. But on the other hand, if we get into feminist economics and if we look at some figures and data on how globalization and trade liberalization has impacted women, we see a number of problems because the relationship between trade and women is not so straightforward. When we talk about negotiating a chapter on trade and gender, we also need to look at the other side of the argument. Because trade agreements and trade liberalization, and trade agreements being instruments of trade liberalization, have led to lower revenue for social welfare support, and social welfare support is mainly consumed by vulnerable and marginalized groups in developing economies, mainly such as women. It has led to various environmental and health impact or crises or even pandemics. Environmental pandemics, we are seeing them, and climate change is now visible today, and we are all fearing that it might lead to an environmental pandemic in the near future. And when the COVID hit, we saw how COVID disproportionately impacted more heavily vulnerable groups such as women than men, when we looked at the stats for various reasons, for the way we are situated and our resource endowments. Trade liberalization has also led to displacement of various jobs and business opportunities in a number of industries which are mainly relevant for women employees and business owners. And finally, even though we say that globalization and trade liberalization has led to increase in jobs for women, it has come at a cost. And the cost is that it has increased feminization of labor. More jobs, but lower wages and even poorer working conditions. So, what do we do? Well, we need to go back to trade agreements and see how they are drafted, how they are negotiated. And even though we say that we need to mainstream gender in trade agreements, how do we mainstream gender in trade agreements? Is it sufficient for us to just negotiate a standalone chapter on trade in women and include a couple of cooperative provisions or reaffirmations to ILO conventions and CEDAW 1979? Or do we want to now think about provisions that can directly attack the barriers that our women in our respective economies and countries face? And that's been a problem because we have seen number of studies have shown how about 21% of trade agreements have already included a commitment relating to women explicitly. So most of these commitments do not talk to, do not respond to the barriers that women face on the ground. And I'll come to this point in a while. But why use trade agreements? Well, we use trade agreements to empower women, and we can possibly use because they have the potential for two reasons. One, they can break the barriers at the borders, within the borders, and across the borders. We are not talking about social barriers. We are talking about barriers related to trade. And they can create opportunities using trade, using globalization, using liberalization, a number of opportunities. Now, moving on to the second question, can they help? Without answering the question, I will present simple facts to you so you can answer the question yourself. The picture is right in front of you, it's clear. I'm giving you a number of examples from across the world where countries have included gender equality, women empowerment related commitments in their trade agreements. And this map is showing us a number of things. First, you see that several countries are front runners in being vocal about women interests in their trade agreements. They have been very active in including such commitments, but the other countries have lagged behind. They have one or even no gender equality related commitment in their trade agreement. The other thing you notice here is how different regions in different countries have added very different kinds of provisions relating to women, right? You see how in Canada, Israel, in Canada, Chile, provisions relate to corporate social responsibility, access to STEM and ICT education, digital skills, promotion of women entrepreneurship. Then if you move to USMCA, you see how there's an exclusive focus on labor rights, reservation for indigenous women, protection of women employees. We move to CPTPP, and the focus changes entirely to access to markets and technology and finance and workplace flexibility. These are innovative provisions that we have normally not seen around in other trade agreements. But when we move to Africa or East African countries, their trade agreements talk about women by committing to increase women's participation in trade agreements, by committing to increase women's participation in decision-making roles, in policy-making roles. In fact, right after EAC, East African Community Agreement, was enforced and ratified, there was a 60% steep increase in the number of parliamentarians who were women who were appointed in the East African Community Parliament. So the regional parliament, there was a 60% increase in the appointment of women parliamentarians right after the agreement was ratified. So I'm not saying that there's a but-for connection between the two, between the ratification of this agreement with a clause that says that we assume a commitment to increase women's representation in policymaking roles and this change happening in the EAC parliament legislation, but maybe this agreement could have led to a contributing factor that led to this change in the EAC parliament. And we move to Europe, where EU, Canada, European Economic Area, they focus on women in their roles as employees, and they also focus a lot on their safety, physical safety, and protection against violence and conflict like situations. Um, we also see how different regions have talked about gender provisions in trade agreements in a variety of different ways. So there are different gender mainstreaming modalities in different regions, right? But when we zoom into Asia Pacific, we find a number of things, number of really interesting things that first we should be proud about. I think these are really positive changes because at the end of the day, they are trade agreements. And two, we should make note of um, why we are still, in a way, in Asia Pacific region, lagging behind. What are the areas where we could progress? Which are the sort of gray areas or loopholes which need our attention as negotiators, as policymakers in the region? So, um, when we look at Asia Pacific countries up until January 2024, so until then we have the data, they have signed about 152 trade agreements. And out of 152, there are only about 14%, which makes up for 20 or 21 trade agreements that have included an explicit provision on gender equality. And that comes as a stark contrast to if you look at South America. Because South America has become, or European Union has become, these are regions that have become leaders, pioneers in the inclusion of gender equality provisions in trade agreements, whereby you look at their trade agreements and you're like, more than 60 or 65% of their trade agreements have an explicit provision on women empowerment or gender equality. Um, but when we move to Asia Pacific as a whole, we see that it's only 14%, so very few trade agreements. Some countries have really been at the front of gender mainstreaming in trade agreements in Asia Pacific, which are Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. And there are many other countries such as India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka that have completely been left out of the race. They have not included not even one, or maybe one recent exception in the case of India, with the trade agreement it signed with Australia or with the EU, where a bare mention of women empowerment and the affirmation was included. These countries have generally stayed away from including commitments, from taking commitments on board relating to women in context of their trade policy as a whole and specifically in their trade agreements. However, when we move to these 14% of trade agreements in Asia Pacific, what kind of provisions do we find? What kind of commitments do we find? Well, we find in 95% of the trade agreements, or 14% of the trade agreements, all we find are right to regulate reservations. So these 14% of trade agreements, a heavy majority of them, or rather I could say all of them with very few exceptions, have included women or gender related commitments in the form of right to regulate reservations, where countries have simply reserved an area of social welfare for their own regulation. And they specify that that area of social regulation or social welfare could be used for childcare, maternity health, women health, and so on and so forth. I guess what I'm trying to say is that positive, concrete commitments, affirmative commitments on increasing women equality, on breaking the barriers that women face on the ground in these countries, is completely missing from these agreements. Primarily, these right to regulate reservations have focused on uh, women's personal welfare concerns, childcare, healthcare, physical safety. Of course, they are binding because they are right to regulate provisions, they are reservations, they are policy carve outs. So they are drafted as binding provisions. So we cannot critique them for being best endeavor. However, they have mostly envisaged, they have mostly talked about women in their roles as mothers and caretakers, not as employees, not as leaders, not as business owners. However, there's a recent change, and that is quite a landmark change. For example, when we look at Japan UK Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, it's a recent agreement that has been negotiated. It has shifted the focus of women as mothers to women as business entrepreneurs and women as employees. It has a standalone chapter on trade and women's economic empowerment. It recognizes the need for these countries to increase women's access to markets, technology, finance, develop women's leadership and business networks. And it has also implemented a number of institutions that would oversee and implement, they will be responsible for the implementation of these commitments. For the lack of time, I won't go through these practice examples from Asia Pacific, but a real quick look or a browse through these examples from these specific agreements will show to you that they're all about reserving the right to regulate several social welfare provisions which focus on women in their roles as mothers or as caretakers. And that brings me to my final question. What are the problems? What are the hesitations? Why do we have such less trade agreements that talk about women first? And second, with these very few number of trade agreements that have been vocal about women's interests, why are they only limited on including policy carve-outs? Why positive, affirmative, concrete commitments that can directly correspond to the problems that women face? What are the major problems that women face in some of these countries? For example, increase in violence, domestic violence against women. There's not a single trade agreement that talks about it. Massive challenges that women face while they work in informal economies. Not a single trade agreement that talks about that. So these are just two bare examples that I show, that I give to you to show the disconnect, the deep disconnect between the provisions that we find in these agreements and the barriers that women face on the ground. And why is that happening? That's happening because there are some genuine hesitations and impediments that policymakers in many developing countries in the region have, which include lack of understanding, awareness, this paucity of data, this paucity of expertise, this negotiation capacity gap between the developed and developing country members of Asia Pacific as a group. There needs to be more political will. I think the Chilean example and the Canadian example have shown to us that political will at the highest level can really filter down and empower women through trade agreements. There's lack of representation of women in the policy making and in the trade negotiation roles. And when we assume commitments relating to women, I think one really important criteria for us is to think about, and I'll conclude on this point, is to think about the cost of compliance. We can include ambitious commitments, including uh, increasing women's access to finance and other productive resources. But what is the cost for complying with this provision? It is huge. Who will bear the cost? The government? A developing country government? Do they have the resources? The private sector? Do they have the incentive to increase women's access to finance and other productive resources? These are the questions we need to answer when we think about the kind of provisions we want to include and to make them meaningful and to make the integration of women's interest in trade agreements meaningful. And finally, the fear of protectionism and cultural imperialism. What may be good may not be socially or morally good for me. Therefore, developing countries have feared a new kind of cultural imperialism or a wave of imperialism when developed countries have talked about provisions relating to women in the context of trade agreements. For lack of time, I will conclude here, but I'm super excited to hear your thoughts, your views, your feedback, and your questions. These are some recent publications, the most recent one being Trade Policy and Gender Equality. A number of questions that I raised today, we answer them, we tackle them in our new book on trade policy and gender equality that I did with my co-panelists, Dorotea Lopez and Genevieve Remy and other authors. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Amrita. It's very interesting to hear your words. I'm certain that the participants of this session are learning so much from these concepts that have to do with the intersectionality of international trade and all the insights from Asia Pacific. I would like to lead us now into a space that will be moderated by a person with ample experience. She is Dorotea López Giral. She is the director of the International Institute of Studies in the University of Chile, and she will be joined by two young voices who will be sharing their perspectives. Welcome. Thank you, Florencia. Thank you, Ana, Florencia, and the entire team for the invitation. And we're very honored to be sharing this space with Amrita Bahri, an expert in this field. And I'm here joined by my two young panelists. I'm very honored to have them here with us too and to be able to listen to the words. Also, I would like to thank IDB INTAL for their work and for being one of the international bodies that have pioneered in addressing this topic, a very relevant topic about gender perspective in free trade agreements, and also for allowing extra room for women in these spaces. Somehow, this needs to be strengthened so that it can transcend barriers of time and it can translate into long-term political decisions, because we know that many of these can be vulnerable over time. I think we've talked at length about how Latin American has been a pioneer in introducing chapters about gender and trade. The first chapter that they subscribed was a free trade agreement between Uruguay and Chile. And lately, several countries have been subscribing these. As Amrita pointed out, critical changes are taking place that need to be strengthened by means of seminars like the one we're holding today. And though we have made some progress, as it was addressed by Professor Bahri, we need to acknowledge the non-neutrality among many other questions. She also talked about gender mainstreaming, but we do have a long way to go to create a more inclusive exchange, and this is only the beginning for us. So I am very delighted to be sharing this panel and introduce two young people who have been working and studying in this topic. They have also participated in forums about international trade, and surely there will be voices representing the present and the future. Antonieta Sepúlveda, she's now finishing her studies in international trade. She did her internship in Geneva in the WTO. She was the youngest attendant in one of the conferences held, and her article was published in Chile. Then we're also joined by Ignacio Sánchez González. He's a lawyer and holds a master's degree. He's from Chile, and he also talks about digital topics with a gender perspective. He's part of the WTO in a specific subject there, and despite his very young age, he's also a published author. Let us start by Ignacio. Thank you both for being here. Ignacio, I would like to ask you, what do you think are the challenges and benefits that Latin American women face when wanting to participate in the market? I know that several of them have been addressed, but what's your opinion on this? Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. So if I were to answer this question very briefly about opportunities and challenges Latin America for women, I would like to pick up on what our colleague Amrita said earlier. Indeed, market is not gender neutral, and this creates different impacts. So from a legal perspective, or at least when talking about legal instruments, free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, although they offer an opportunity to have inclusive provisions, they're still an instrument for commercial or trade politics. So from a holistic perspective, I would say they need to be complemented with other instruments so that we can really do this mainstreaming in terms of gender in the international trade arena. And we also need to take into account the myriad challenges that our region faces because of inequality. And in this sense, inequality permeates trade and other factors, and it has a deep impact in those topics. We know that one of the main challenges in our region, and this is supported by different studies and by our entities, is that there's a fewer percentage of delegations who there is fewer representation of women in the delegations that advocate for women's rights. Actually, there's a publication by the University of Chile, Latin American Journey of Trade Policies, that tackles this very same topic in the case of Chile. It's a very interesting article, and we see this happening in Latin America. Additionally, there are the challenges of discrimination, harassment, which affects all areas, labor, trade, etc. And another study from here showed that over 30% of women working in international trade also experienced harassment. Very quickly, if I may, talking about opportunities, since we've covered challenges, Latin America, despite this inequality, offers plenty of entrepreneurial spirit. And we see this in small companies and medium companies as well. And we see the percentage of women's participation being larger here. So this is a way, there can be ways for companies led by women to be promoted. Please remember to turn on your mic. I apologize. I got carried away. Thank you, Ignacio, for reminding us that free trade agreements are only one of the many instruments available in the public policy sphere. And as Amrita pointed out, we need a far deeper cultural change to take place. And we need to understand where women are located and what they're doing. Antonieta, go ahead. Because you've studied agreements and you have a special passion for these topics, would you tell us, in your perspective, how do you see Asia? Can you maybe review what you feel about the topic in terms of Latin America? Can you tell us a bit this agreement between Chile and Uruguay that was signed and that now has included the European Union, which includes a different chapter on trade and gender? Thank you for joining us. First of all, thank you, Dorotea, for the kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here. Answering your question, gender in trade agreements has taken many forms depending on how they're organized in our countries. If we analyze our region, I'll actually go back a little in time before the Uruguay and Chile agreement. The first trade agreement that included a specific gender provision was the trade agreement between Chile and Canada. in 1997. This addressed provisions in two specific sections. First, cooperation in labor aspects, and this included provisions in terms of place of work and salary equality. And there's another section that also covers similar topics. It may be that the provisions I just mentioned sound like very vague commitments nowadays, but we need to consider them in the context where they were drafted. And this agreement that I just mentioned is one of the first international binding agreements that mentions gender equality explicitly. And as Dorotea and the rest of the panelists also explained, there has been progress. There are multiple ways to address gender equality in trade agreements. I would say that this new trend can be located between 2015 and 2017, and it's connected with a few milestones in the international arena. First, I'd like to mention, and I know that many of you are familiar with this, is the establishment of the 2030 UN Agenda. Actually, goal number 5 has to do with gender equality. United Nations mentions that gender equality is one of the ways to get to the 2030 goals. Another milestone is took place in Buenos Aires, the Buenos Aires Declaration. It was subscribed by multiple members of the organization, and subscribers committed to include gender equalities in everything that has to do with future generations of trade agreements. Another relevant milestone, especially at the time, are third generation trade agreements, driven by the European region mostly. And here, not only trade topics were involved, but also indirect topics. For example, the environment, intellectual property, and energy. So adding all these milestones together opens up the door to a new way to include gender provisions through the chapters we've mentioned. The first chapter, as Dorotea mentioned, both in the region and worldwide, is the chapter of a free trade agreement between Chile and Uruguay. After this, several chapters have been included, and in the case of Chile, and I will talk about Chile not only because it's where I come from, because it's a pioneering country in the region. Chile has several gender chapters with Ecuador, Paraguay, Canada, Singapore, which is in the Pacific Alliance context, and there's a renegotiation process in the Free Trade Agreement, European Union, and Chile. This is one of the most, the ones that show the most progress in this topic, and among many others. So in short, there are two main ways to include gender provisions, and there has been an evolution over time. Before 2015, there were provisions throughout an entire treaty, and this was repeated in the preamble and in some specific chapters. As from 2015 onwards, we see dedicated chapters devoted to trade and gender.
Muchas gracias, Antonieta. Ignacio, vamos hacia tus temas, hacia lo que has escrito mucho sobre el vínculo de lo digital y la perspectiva de género. No sé si a ustedes les pasa, a mí se me están mezclando los canales inglés y español. Ya está. Que nos cuentes, porque claramente hoy
Okay,
día dos de los
so
grandes temas que
I'd like
ocupan
for
la
you to
agenda
talk a bit
son
about
los temas digitales,
this because,
los
of
temas
course,
medioambientales que llevan tiempo ya,
technology,
y los temas de género.
digitalization,
¿Cómo se
IT
cruzan estos
is
temas
a
y cuál es la
top
relevancia
of the
de
agenda.
comprenderlos así?
So how can we think of
Sí,
that
perfecto, muchas
with
gracias.
a gender perspective that
Efectivamente,
is
hoy
through a gender
día,
lens?
pese a que
Okay,
en un
sure.
principio quizás nacen como
First of
temas
all,
distintos, por un
I
lado,
would
la
think that
perspectiva de género
on
en
their
este caso y por
onset,
otro
they
lado,
are
comercio
very
digital, por una
different.
base
So we
bastante
have
diversa, la
digital
perspectiva
trade
hace
on the
un
one
poquito
hand
generar los
and then the
vínculos y
gender
cómo el
perspective.
comercio digital
But
puede
the
o
challenge
ayudar
here is
a
to see how they
transversalizar
can
la
come
perspectiva de
together. That
género en el
is,
comercio. Y
how
precisamente son
digital trade can
los dos grandes
used
temas,
as a
¿verdad?,
tool for
del
gender
Foro Público y de
inclusion.
la Organización Mundial del Comercio
Something that happened at the WTO is to develop inclusive policies for trade, in particular focusing on how we can make digital trade more inclusive. Of course, the environmental issues are also high on the agenda, but we can see that gender is really important as well. In my point of view, the way that I see trade, we can see a similarity between digital trade and its necessary dependence to digital infrastructure, right? So it's no surprising to see different studies that we see that women and girls have less of an opportunity when it comes to accessing careers that are high in digital infrastructure. Why? Because they are deprived of that infrastructure in general. Regardless, what we can see is that digital trade can be used as a tool if we include a gendered lens there. Why? Because the digital structure can be inclusive and resilient. And if we have good governance, we can create a regional digital market where inclusion is key. For that, we need clear governance and clear principles. And if we do that, we can create a more inclusive trade because it will allow people to access to the wider market through the digital market. Digital market offers more autonomy, more flexibility, um, less resources when it comes to getting started. So that can be really attractive, of course. So we can think of enabling trade, but at the same time, enabling digital trade and enabling digital structures as tools to promote more equality. And of course, since we are looking at this from the Latin American context, and because in Latin America, digital trade and digital governance are deeply interlinked, I would like to mention that there has been a conference in Brazil recently where they tackled this topic and they created an agreement dealing with digital governance. And that agreement acknowledges that there are different layers of governance. One of that, the UN layer, of course. So what did Brazil do? Well, they decided that digital governance needs to follow certain principles, and these principles are equality principles, equality in decision making, for example. And of course, even though digital infrastructure can be a great tool for tackling economic development, it also needs to tackle gender inequality. And we need to keep that in mind as we do research, but also as we develop measures that impact reality, because these are not two different things. That's why I think it's relevant to keep an eye on the digital infrastructure and digitalization when we study trade, because this is absolutely necessary for inclusion.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio. Muchas gracias,
Thank
además,
you,
por estas conclusiones del Mundial de
Ignacio,
los 10 en el que
for all of this
participaste. Sin
and for
duda,
sharing your
la
experiences
gobernanza
in this
digital y las
Congress in
tecnologías sí
Brazil. I am
contempla
sure
que
that if
también pueden
digital
ser no
trade does
neutrales,
not
vuelven a generar muchos
contemplate that
problemas.
they are not
Hemos
gender
visto
neutral
cuando
and
durante
they
muchos años
don't
el
contribute to
comercio y
this,
las
they are going to
políticas
keep
económicas se
perpetuating
consideraban
all of
también
these
neutrales.
problems that
Antonieta,
we saw in trade at large.
ahora vamos como a una
Now,
segunda etapa
Antonieta,
que la mencionó
I would like
Amrita. Sin duda,
to
negociar, tener todos
keep
estos
talking
capítulos
about
es
something that
importante, es una manera
Amrita
de
mentioned as
visibilizar, de
well.
generar
Um,
conciencia, etcétera.
she talked
Pero
about
hay
how
una parte que es
important these
fundamental
chapters
y que nos ha
are
costado
in
no
terms of
solamente en este
raising
nuevo grupo de
awareness of
países, sino que
gender
nos
and
ha costado
trade.
en todos los temas
But
a los
there's
países,
something
es
that
un
has been really
implemento de
hard,
compromisos.
that is
Porque,
implementation, right?
como decía Amrita, son palabras súper
So as
bonitas,
Enrita
es un
said, there are
compromiso, nos vamos a
beautiful
quedar toda
words,
la
right?
vida, pero luego al
Commitment, we
lograr el
want to
éxito va a
follow
ser el tener
that.
que lograr
But
implementarlo.
then how
¿Qué
do
están
we
haciendo los
translate
países
that
para
to reality?
implementarlos?
So what are countries doing in terms of implementation?
Perfecto. Cuando uno
Great.
habla de la implementación de
Well,
los
when we
capítulos de
talk
trade
about
específicamente,
implementing
cuando uno
trade gender chapters, we need to understand that chapters include different measures, for example, creating committees that will tackle gender issues. And these committees are in charge of implementing the commitments in the chapter. In general, if it's a bilateral agreement, we will have representatives from both countries in the committee, and they will meet annually or twice a year, maybe, so that they can set out a plan for what's the goal of the chapters. When it comes to my research, what I found is that one of the things that are really common is that they do workshops and seminars like this one, but they are promoted by the different governments. And in Chile, for example, there are different forums of inclusive trade where different women are invited, women that are policymakers, scholars, and business people, so that they can come together and share information. And this is really beneficial for them. Of course, this targets the main beneficiaries of the gender chapters that are women, obviously. This being said, I also want to point out that this implementation is not really followed up on. There aren't tools to follow up how um, the chapters are being implemented and how good the implementation is. And I think there's a missed opportunity there. Finally, I would like to say that these gender chapters tend to be included in a cooperation chapter, so they are not included in the dispute settlement section of the trade agreements. That means that if there is a breach of this gender commitment, there is not a tool to implement anything regarding it.
Muchas gracias, Antonieta. O sea, de alguna manera seguimos en
Thank you,
compromisos que son más bien de
Antonieta.
carácter
So
facultativo,
basically, we
no
have this
vinculante.
non-binding commitments
La implementación
bill,
todavía tiene
and
desempeños
implementation
importantes y
is
cierto que todavía
still
son
something that we need
todavía
to
muy
work
jóvenes,
on.
pero
Of course, these agreements are really
yo creo que es
young,
donde tenemos hoy día que
but
hacer hincapié cómo
that's
vamos
something that we need to
implementando
work
esto.
on. We need
Y
to
en eso me
focus
gustaría
on
regresar a Ignacio,
implementation.
como si nos pudieses
And
contar,
that's
si te
why I'd
parece,
like
¿hay
to ask Ignacio
alguna
about
lección que podamos aprender de
whether
otros
there's
países?
any
Todos conocemos
lessons
que Canadá
learned
es uno de los
that we
países
can
más
take away
avanzados
from
en
other countries. I'm thinking Canada, which is a
tipo
pioneer in this regard.
de incluir la perspectiva, disminuir la brecha,
Yes, when it
lograr un
comes to
comercio más
reducing
inclusivo, que
the
al final
gender
es el objetivo que
gap.
tenemos todos. ¿Y qué
Of course,
piensas
that's our
tú
goal
cómo
here.
podemos
So, what do you
implementarlo
think?
en
How
América
can
Latina?
we learn from those experiences and translate
Gracias.
them to the Latin
Sí,
American
en
context?
efecto, sí, si bien
Okay,
en la
sure.
misma región hay experiencias, yo creo que son
Of course,
valorables
we have
específicamente a
experience in
propósito
our
de
own
esta perspectiva más
region,
holística que
but it's
mencionaba al
also
principio,
interesting
salir de un
to look
discurso
at
particular
other
para
regions
verlo
in the world
holístico.
because we are tackling
Tenemos
this
las
from a
peculiaridades
holistic
femeninas, creo
perspective.
que eso no hay que perderlo de vista en nuestra región, pero
But
sí,
also, I
como
think that
abordamos
we
ambos
have
en
good
foros,
examples in our
efectivamente
regions that
Canadá,
we need to look at as
también la
well.
Unión Europea
If
en
we
su
look
caso,
outside
creo
the
que
region,
van por buenos
Canada is
caminos
definitely a
de comercio más
leader in this
inclusivo
regards
y
when it comes to
probablemente un
building a
tema
more
que
inclusive
a
trade.
mi juicio también poco se habla,
And there's
eh,
something that is
que es
not really talked about
más allá de las mujeres. O sea,
that
si
is,
estamos hablando de
let's go
perspectiva de
beyond
género
women. So if you're
o de un
talking
comercio
about a
inclusivo, muchas veces se
gender
dejan fuera otra serie de
perspective,
grupos
well, we should
marginalizados
not
o grupos desaventajados, como
overlook
un
other
concepto más
marginalized
usado en el
groups.
derecho antidiscriminación, grupos desaventajados en
I'm
áreas de
thinking
comercio.
about
Si bien obviamente
the legal perspective here, of
poner el foco en
course.
mujeres es
Of course, we
necesario,
need to focus
también
on women, but
es igual de
also
necesario poner
on
un foco en
other
emprendedores
groups
LGBT+, por
that
ejemplo,
are
o en
members
personas
of the
trans
LGBT
vinculadas
community,
con
for
el comercio
example, or trans
internacional,
people that
etcétera.
are
Y creo
also
que ese es un ejemplo
part
que
of
Canadá
these
ofrece, puesto que
chapters in
efectivamente tiene
gender
un área de
inclusion.
trabajo, además de empresas lideradas por mujeres o
So we
mujeres
need to
indígenas
think, for example,
exportadoras,
in
también
Canada,
tiene un
they
foco en
have
estos grupos
women-led
desaventajados.
companies,
Mencionar también un
indigenous women-led
instrumento
companies as
en
well, and they
Canadá
receive
que es
several
bastante
benefits.
relevante, el análisis de género plus o
And
EDA plus de la
something that
política
they,
comercial,
they do is
para evaluar
also
precisamente los
analyze
impactos
LGBT
o para
participation
formular
in
y luego implementar políticas
trade, in
comerciales
particular
y o
international
los
trade.
acuerdos de libre comercio.
in order to include their perspective in the free trade agreements. Moving on to the EU, that are different initiatives there that aim to promote um, women leading companies and women offering goods and services in the market. And of course, Antonieta and Amrita have already mentioned how they have pioneered different legal instruments that can make this inclusion more certain. But I also want to stress, as I said before, that these policies should not tackle women, but also other groups that are included from a legal point of view in the gender
Muchísimas gracias,
definition.
Ignacio. Para cerrar,
Thank
ya que
you,
estamos
Ignacio.
cumpliendo muy bien en el
Now,
tiempo,
we are a
y
bit pressed
Florencia
for time,
no nos pone en
and
orden.
I don't want Florencia to
¿Qué has
have to
estudiado?
say
De acuerdo,
anything to us.
lo has ido
So,
deslizando en las
Antonieta,
respuestas que has hecho, pero
you
nos
have
gustaría
studied
saber
these
si a ti te
agreements at
dijeran, si
length.
mañana fueras la jefa
So,
negociadora,
I would ask you, if
¿qué
you
te vas
were the chief
vas a hacer? ¿Qué
negotiator
nuevas
tomorrow,
disciplinas? ¿Qué
what
le incluirías?
would
¿Cómo
you
lo
include?
reforzarías?
What would you do to
¿Los quitarías? Ya
strengthen
hablaste un poco de
these
tu
free
preocupación
trade
de que sean
agreements when it
vinculantes,
comes to gender
transversalizar.
provisions, of course?
¿Cuáles serían? Y además
What
a
would
todos
you
los que han
take
ido comentando
away?
en el chat, los invito a leer a
So please,
Antonieta y a
Antonieta,
Ignacio, que ambos
I would
tienen
like for you
publicaciones
to
también
answer these
sobre
questions.
el
And for
tema de
everyone
mañana
here,
y
read
para
what
también
Ignacio
seguir
and
dialogando
Antonieta
con
have
otros
written,
jóvenes que
because
se han
their
metido en estos
research is
temas.
really
Antonieta, adelante.
interesting, and they are young,
Bueno,
particularly.
primero, antes
Okay,
de hablar de los
Antonieta.
déficits, quiero
Okay,
importante
I'm going to talk
resaltar
a
todas
bit
las cosas que están
about
haciendo
the
porque
challenges
yo
that
creo que
these
todos los que estamos aquí presentes
agreements face,
sabemos
but
que
also I
cuando
want
uno
to stress
piensa
the
hoy
work
día
that's
en
being
relaciones
done.
internacionales y en comercio
I know
exterior
that when
y en
we
los
think
desafíos que
about
estos
international
presentan,
trade, we can think
tenemos que
about
conectar con lo que
challenges, but we
realmente
also
está al lado
understand that
nuestro, que
there
es parte de lo que estaba hablando
isn't
Ignacio. A lo que
one
me
problem that
refiero
is
es
not
que
connected to
no podemos
another
mirar
problem. They
todo
are
como
all
gracias a lo
interrelated.
negociado, sino que
So we
todo
need to
es
look at
parte de un
this
sistema más
from
amplio.
a
Por
holistic
ejemplo, los
perspective.
diferentes desafíos con los que contamos en América Latina
That's
en temas de
why the
desarrollo
challenges
no
that we have
podemos
in
pensar
Latin
en
America
separarlos
when it
sin
comes
pensar
to
en otras temáticas
development,
que quizás se
well,
relacionan
we cannot
directamente,
overcome them without
como seguridad
tackling other
social, acceso a
problems.
salud, educación,
For
y
example,
obviamente
access
uno
to
no puede
health, access
pensar
to
el desarrollo
education. And
sin un importante
also,
factor que es el
we
comercio
cannot
exterior,
think about this
por lo
if
que creo
without
que se ha dado
considering
mayor inclusión
international
del género dentro de
trade.
la política comercial de los países de la
And
región,
that's why
especialmente.
thinking
Es un
about
paso en la dirección
gender in
correcta.
trade and in
Obviamente para
international
superar
trade, it's a
problemas de
step in the
desarrollo.
right
Ahora
direction
bien,
when it comes
claramente
to
creo que esto no
development.
significa que no haya cosas que mejorar.
This doesn't mean that
El
there
primer
aren't
punto que me
things that we
gustaría
can
hacer es
improve,
respecto a un
right?
déficit que yo he logrado
One
encontrar
challenge,
dentro de
something
los
that we need
acuerdos
to
comerciales
tackle,
mencionados,
uh, that
es
I have
que
found as
estos,
I
y ya lo mencioné
researched these
brevemente, suelen no
free
estar
trade
en
agreements,
paralelo del sistema de
is
solución
that
de controversias que se generan
they
dentro de los acuerdos.
do not tend to be binding.
Esto
That
es
is, the chapters
especialmente
dealing with these
problemático porque
provisions
si bien
are
puede que
not
sean
included in the
iniciativas y
chapters
que
that are
representen un
subject to
avance,
dispute
realmente no
resolution.
existe ningún tipo de reprimenda en el
So if
momento
we
de que
do not
estos
have
acuerdos de
any
las partes
tool
no los
when it comes
cumplan.
to
Por lo que si bien son
enforcing
vinculantes,
these commitments, then
puede que
that means
lleguen a
that
no
they are
tener un
not
impacto tan
binding,
grande como
and
se quiso en el momento
therefore
que
their
se negociaron.
impact is not as big as
También
the impact
otro
that may have
desafío a
been
superar que
intended
yo
when
creo que es que
negotiating these
necesitamos generar
agreements.
compromisos internacionales de mayor envergadura y
Another
más
thing that I
ambiciosos.
think is
A lo
that
que
we
me
need to be
refiero
more
es que
ambitious
los
in our
compromisos no sean
negotiations.
únicamente
These
temáticos
commitments
convencionales como
should
igualdad
not just
salarial, los
tackle
principios establecidos en las
um,
convenciones
equal pay
internacionales
for
de los
equal
derechos de
work
la
and all
mujer,
these things that
sino que se
have been
generen
existed
políticas que
for a
alcancen
while now.
concretas con el
We need to
objetivo de
think
empoderar a las mujeres
about
y de nivelar el campo de juego entre
different
distintas áreas.
implementations that we can
Ya
have in
que
our
si bien las
modern
disposiciones y los
world as
compromisos
well.
que vemos mayoritariamente hoy en día son generales al comercio,
Most of
las
the
mujeres no participan de igual
agreements that
manera
we
en
see
todos los
right
sectores del
now
comercio.
are
Para
very
ejemplificar esto,
generic,
las
but
mujeres
and
nos
they include
encontramos
gender
mayormente
ideas,
empleadas a
but
nivel
they
mundial
don't acknowledge the
dentro
fact
del
that
sector
women
servicios.
do not participate in trade as much
Entonces,
as
creo que es
men.
necesario
So we
generar
need to
condiciones
tackle that as well.
donde
We need
los
to
sectores del servicio, donde las mujeres nos
see
encontremos
how
mayormente
the
empleadas,
different sectors where
eh,
women are mostly
puedan
employed, for example,
mejorar o aumentar su
service,
participación en el
can
comercio para que de esta
take
manera las
a
mujeres
greater
que participan en estos
part
sectores y que les
in
gustaría
international
poder
trade, so that women that are
internacionalizarse
part of
también
those
se puedan
industries
beneficiar de un capítulo de
can
género que analice específicamente
benefit
la
from
situación
these
de las mujeres en
provisions that
América Latina y
are
a nivel mundial.
specifically
Esto ya no
geared
solo
to
se
their
refiere al
needs
sector
in their
servicios, sino que al
context.
sector agricultura, que
I'm
también dentro de
thinking
nuestro
in
país
other
es un
sectors
sector
manufacture, agriculture. I'm thinking of all of these sectors where we see that women occupy most of the jobs. So those sectors need to be tackled specifically. Another aspect is that there isn't a lot of gender disaggregated data. And in academics, it's really important for us to have data if we want to study the impact of trade on gender. Data is necessary for research, but also, most importantly, for policymakers. We have been working on this for 6 years, yes, when it comes to negotiating gender chapters in free trade agreements. And we do that without having clear data. So that's why we negotiate generic agreements instead of focusing on specific needs that are needed. And we cannot measure whether our commitments have a clear impact. Finally, I would like to say that it's not just the discussion, but also the progress that we need to focus on. And it's important that this conversation is not limited to professionals and people who take part in trade, but also every woman can have a voice in this, whether they are already taking part in international trade or whether they want to take part in international trade. We see that many women do not have access to this and they are not even aware of their rights under these treaties and the commitments under these treaties that benefit them. So all of these agreements do not have the desired impact, mostly because of lack of awareness. So I think that it's really necessary to have tools like this seminar so that
Muchas gracias,
we can have more
Antonieta.
inclusion and
Muchas
more
gracias,
equality.
Ignacio y Antonieta,
Thank you very much.
participar en
Thank
este
you,
conversatorio.
Antonieta and
Muchas
Ignacio,
felicidades
for
a los dos.
participating in
Ojalá
this
muchos
session.
más jóvenes
Congratulations on
unan
your
la
work.
investigación en estos
And
temas y la
hopefully,
reflexión en estos
many
temas
more people will join
que
this
INTAL
discussion.
está invitando. Florencia,
And
muchísimas
IDB
gracias por
Intal is
habernos
extending an
invitado.
invitation to join
De
that. Thank you
regreso
so
a
much,
Dorotea
Florencia,
López
for the
Giral.
invitation. And I give the floor back to you. Thank you, Dorotea. Congratulations, Antonieta and Ignacio, for your answers. Listening to you was very interesting. Let's open up the floor for questions. This is a very enriching space so that we can ask these experts what they know about the topic. We have compiled a few questions from the audience. We got several questions throughout the session. The first questions are intended for Amrita. I will ask 2 questions in a row for Amrita. And please, Amrita, if you could devote 2 or 3 minutes to answering each of these questions. First question, in connection to gender provisions, what provisions and in which chapters should they be what should be drafted in international treatment so that women can be empowered in labor aspects? And second question, why do you think that gender chapters are not controversial about gender provisions? These are some topics that were dealt with throughout the session, but let's see what you, Amrita, think about this.
Great. Thank you, Florencia. I think I want to share 2 points for the first question and then 2 points for the second question. For the first question, what kind of provisions and chapters can we look at? I think there are 2 important things to consider. One, when we talk about labor context, women commitments have been added in labor provisions and drafted as labor standards for quite a lot of time. I mean, we go beyond some old trade agreements, because if you look at very old Canadian and European and even NAFTA, women related commitments were only drafted as labor standards. So I think it's time for us to move beyond labor chapters when we talk about women in trade agreements. Now, how do we go beyond? What kind of provisions and chapters do we use to empower women, to add such provisions, to mainstream such commitments. I think one really good development that Dorotea, Ignacio, and Antonieta have already mentioned in this dialogue is how standalone chapters and how standalone provisions have increased the visibility of this issue in trade agreements. But I have two fundamental problems with that. One, they do not talk about and they do not address the barriers that women in these economies face. I think there is a deep disconnect between the policy solutions that these trade agreements and these provisions are offering and the actual barriers that women are facing on the ground. We were doing a survey where we found as a result that one of the main problems that women face in developing countries in Asia Pacific region is the challenges they encounter working in informal economy and the problems they have in moving from informal to formal economy. Not a single trade agreement in the region talks about this problem. Just one example to show the disconnect. So perhaps it's time for us to negotiate these provisions in light of the challenges that women in our economies in our respective jurisdictions face. And how do we do that? By encouraging dialogue with the private stakeholders. There needs to be a channel of communication and exchange between negotiators and women associations, women representatives. So the negotiators can know what the problems are that they need to deal with in these trade agreements. And second, important thing to consider here is that, and I'll be very, I mean, I'll say that in a very straightforward way. Most of the provisions on gender equality in trade agreements are limited to reaffirmations to international conventions. We affirm our cooperation on enhancing women's access to education, access to skill development, and so on and so forth. Or a simple mention of we affirm the importance of women empowerment in the agreement's preamble or the objectives clause. What we don't find, and this is what we need, this is where we need to go now, is to include women-related commitments in chapters and provisions of trade agreements that are directly related to trade, market access. For example, technical barriers to trade. Women deal with a number of industries that continue to face various technical barriers to trade, such as trade in services. Majority of employees in services industry in the world, mainly in developing countries, are women. So we need to start talking about reducing technical barriers to trade in services, mainly in developed countries, for the movement of women from developing to developed countries. Second, tariff barriers to trade. Recent studies have shown how pink tariffs, how discriminatory tariffs have disproportionately impacted women traders and women consumers. Because even though the tariffs have been reduced in many other industries and sectors, tariffs continue in industries that are most relevant for women, such as textiles, agriculture, clothing, footwear. So maybe that's another area to work on. Government procurement. ITC studies shows that only 1% of public procurement market caters to women entrepreneurs. Maybe there's something wrong there. Maybe we need to simplify or create a simplified version of the process of GPAs to enable small businesses owned and managed by women in developing countries to have more access to or a larger access to public procurement opportunities. These are just three examples of different innovative provisions that we need to start thinking about, and others. So I guess the main thing that I'm trying to say here is that we need to take gender equality related provisions beyond the standalone chapters on trade and gender and include them in market access related chapters that directly relate to trade. And to respond to the second question, why can't we still assume binding commitments? Why are we still, okay, excellent, congratulations. We have wonderful standalone chapters now on trade in women. None of them are subject to dispute settlement mechanism. None. With the recent example of EU Chile, they've come up with a soft enforcement mechanism, which shows us that probably we are not ready. We are not at a point where we want to assume binding commitments for a number of reasons that we've already talked about, including lack of data and lack of evidence on the interrelationship between the two. So perhaps EU Chile is a sample that we can look at and get some really brilliant ideas on how we can think about including soft enforcement mechanism, not using the traditional remedies of sanctions and financial compensation and cross retaliation, but using softer ways and softer remedies, such as creating incentives and disadvantages related to compliance and non-compliance with gender-related provisions in trade agreements. And I think EU Chile provides a good sort of menu of options for us on different soft enforcement mechanisms that we can start talking about and include. Maybe that could be the starting point. I think we are following the footsteps of labor provisions and environmental provisions in trade agreements. We are behind, we are way behind, and we don't have the appetite for trade in gender yet that we have for trade in labor for clear reasons. But I think we will get there, but we need to start from somewhere. So when we talk about enforcement, maybe we can start with soft enforcement, with soft remedies.
Thank you very much, Amrita. I have a question for Antonieta. Please devote 2 or 3 minutes to this question so that there's time for Ignacio and Dorotea to answer the question. Antonieta, how can we move on from discourses, provisions, and reserves to concrete actions in building public policies that are inclusive and diverse? This is a very good question, also a very valid one. It's not easy to materialize these topics. I think many efforts have been taking place for a while that are oriented to this place. For example, there was a feminist implementation of regulations, and this is a specific action to really materialize gender issues across all government institutions. And this is an important way to move forward into specific actions. For example, in Chile, we've been having a foreign feminist policy for 2 years now. And one of the pillars of trade and gender is the following. Normally, all the work I've described is in charge of the Subsecretariat of International Trade Affairs. But now there are several ministries, because gender perspective has been expanded so much, and now it permeates all ministries. For example, there's another ministry has just issued a roadmap that, in the context of foreign affairs, thanks to this gender perspective that has been mainstreamed across the entire government, we can reach to more people and more institutions. And this means that we can develop public policies that have a different set of tools than the ones we already know. Certainly, a roadmap may not just be a specific action, but it is some form of progress, because it's a state institution that normally would not do this and now is doing it. And so this shows us that there's an institutional intention to move in this direction. And this is why this policy, which is being implemented in many countries around the world, is just one more way to draft policies with a focus on women and focusing also in terms of trade and state issues in general. Thank you, Antonieta. Let's move on to a question for Ignacio. Talking about the gender digital gap, how can we come up with appropriation tools when it comes to in relation to digital tools so that we can surpass this problem. Thank you, Florencia. I would go back to talking about governance and this unexplored, intricate relationship between digital trade, infrastructure, digital infrastructure, general trade. I think solid training sessions in terms of infrastructure, access to services, digital technologies for women is key. That way, we can leverage the many benefits of digital trade. Also, women can reach companies that work in the digital sphere. In this sense, digital technologies have plenty to offer. Unfortunately, because of political reasons, many times there's an overlap, and some digital technologies that help towards a more inclusive market. For example, 5G in a country means that this network can give access to people who normally did not have 5G connectivity. But because of geopolitical issues, sometimes this is not the case. And in the case of Costa Rica, there's a specific mention to a bidding process in Costa Rica. And these topics certainly affect the way the gender perspective can be materialized in concrete examples of inclusive businesses. So this is why digital governance is key. In terms of digital governance, the state does not have as much sovereignty as is expected. So we need to foster a good governance process so that there can be enough engineers and enough infrastructure so that everyone can participate. Thank you, Ignacio. And one last question before we wrap up this session. This question is for Dorotea. Given the current context where globalization and technology are reshaping international trade, what specific strategies can small and medium companies adopt in developing countries to ensure inclusive participation in global markets? And how can governments and international organizations efficiently support these type of initiatives? Well, I mean, if I answer this question in 2 minutes, I should get a Nobel Prize. How to include small and medium companies? That is the million-dollar question for Latin American countries and any developing country. Small and medium companies are normally the companies that offer the most employment, especially for women, meaning women are mostly employed by small and medium companies. And normally the big players, at least in international trade, are large companies. Countries like Chile, where we've managed to introduce ourselves significantly in the economy, has a low percentage of women, as Ana announced at the beginning of this session, a low percentage of women in internationalized or global companies. And we know that global companies always offer better salaries, better work conditions, etc. Many studies are available as to how to include small and medium companies. It is not an easy task. It's about state policies, public policies, long-term policies, and our countries in particular are very short-term oriented many times. However, I think it's a very interesting challenge for Intal to have maybe a next seminar on how to include small and medium companies in this trade journey, so to speak, because it's the only way, I think, where we can get to a more inclusive trade. Thank you, Dorotea. That was the last question for our panelists. And